And we're back talking about what it's like to actually live in a socialist or communist country. Viorica Robinson came to Canada from Romania, and Anna Rizzo came to Canada from Venezuela. So I want to ask you, Viorica, about just sort of freedom of speech. If you think back to when you were living in Romania, this is something that I've heard of. It's a criticism that there's a sort of a clamping down by socialist and communist regimes where they do not allow citizens to speak out. Is that true in your experience? Is that what happened?
That's exactly right. You could not just express whatever you think, whatever you want to talk about. We had to be very careful who we're talking to and what subject we're talking about. We're not allowed to listen, for instance, to radios from outside Romania. So everything was controlled. What we hear, what we see, what we learn in school, what the kids were, taught very, very early in life. So no, you could not just go there and talk to anybody about anything that you want to talk about. If it was anything about the system or the regime or anything that was against their rules, you probably would suffer some consequences. Now, I don't know what it is, but we know people end up in jail, people end up dead if they spoke about the regime or anything against.
So if you held a protest and said that, the president's doing a terrible job, you could end up in jail or maybe killed, something like
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. You
Wow.
are sometimes afraid even to talk to close family about certain subjects. So you have to be very, very careful who you talk to and what you talk about. Absolutely.
Is that because there was enormous pressure to turn people in?
Well, I think people like the regime didn't want you to, spread other ideas than what they want you to believe. Doesn't mean like we did not know what's going on. It's just that we had to be careful because there were consequences if you talk against the regime or any other subject. They were not allowed, to be kind of, it wasn't free speech. Definitely.
Right.
Everything was controlled.
And
Everything.
Anna, what about in your experience in Venezuela?
In Venezuela, it was a little bit different. Like, certainly in Venezuela, people can watch TV channels from other countries too, including the United States. But when it comes to national TV, there was a big pressure put on journalists who questioned the government. When it comes to local media, there was a lot of pressure. So in Venezuela, we had this important, very big TV channel that was called Radio Caracas Televisión, and it lasted for many, many years. So it was like some sort of like, it's like saying here the CBC, but different to the CBC. They used to question the government all the time. So they will say, like, they will invite politicians, both from the oppositions or the government, and they will make questions. But the government didn't like this at all, the Hugo Chavez government, and eventually they completely shut down this news channel, which sparked a lot of protests in Venezuela because it was a huge attempt against our freedom of expression, freedom of press. And they started, starting from that, that was like persecution for journalists, persecution for, they started to buy newspapers that were independent, and they
Mm.
considered that the newspapers were private. But when you look at the person who is now owning this newspaper, they're usually connected to the government. So they applied
Wow.
these strategies that started to impact our freedom of press and freedom of speech.
What about in terms of the right to protest? If you wanted to organize a protest to say Hugo Chavez is doing a terrible job, is that something you could do? And if you did it, what would you face any repercussions?
It depends on how big the protests were, and it depends who does it. Right now in Venezuela, they still have protests. For example, my parents, they still go to protest against the government. But I don't know,
Hmm.
the Venezuelan government is like, since these are old people, they don't care as much. But if it's the students or like a lot of people, then they care and they can send the military to oppress these people.
Mm. And what would the military do?
Well, it can go from arbitrarily arresting people in the spot or even killing them.
Wow. That's obviously pretty brutal if the public can't speak out and voice their concerns or thoughts on how the government's doing. We'll be back with more in a few minutes. We're talking about what it's actually like to live in communist and socialist regimes. Thanks for tuning in.